Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the European Parliament here in Brussels, which is the heart of the EU. And in today's programme we're discussing three very important and significant issues. The first is that the new Italian Foreign Minister is a very strong advocate that Israel should be a member of the European Union. So we'll be asking in today's programme, should Israel be allowed to become a member of the European Union? The second issue we're discussing is the ongoing crisis in Syria. And now that, according to intelligence reports, it is believed that Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, is using chemical and biological weapons against his own people in the civil war against the rebels. So we'll be asking, what can the EU do to actually protect the Syrians caught up in this conflict? And the final issue we're going to be discussing in today's programme is looking at the plight of women in the Middle East and how the EU can play a very important role in supporting women's rights and freedoms. And in today's programme, I'm joined by Sari Essayah, MP from the Finnish Christian Party, and Andrew Tucker, representing the European Coalition for Israel, and Charlotte Gutman, who's a PR specialist, also Vice President of the Coordination Committee of Jewish Organisations here in Belgium. So welcome to the European Report. Sorry, can you tell us a little bit about our viewers, about the very important work that you're doing on behalf of Israel? And also, does your passion for Israel stem from your own Christian convictions?
Well, as a member of the Israel delegation, I have a very good opportunity to influence through the parliamentary relations between the European Parliament and Knesset. We have frequent meetings and we also have frequent delegation visits. And I wish to promote the cooperation and good relations between Israel and the EU. More generally, the situation in the Middle East is very often debated here in the European Parliament, and when I'm involved in those debates, I of course try to promote the EU angle of pro-Israel, and also I have a good opportunity to be involved in those drafting reports, texts, and so those are the concrete ways how I can influence in this work. And well, one resolution which is very close to my heart was from 2010 when I made a resolution to release Gilad Shalit, and that resolution went through in this European Parliament plenary session, and I think that it was one of those small pieces which was actually helping to release Gilad Shalit after those horrible years in hostage.
No, it's fantastic. And last November I was at the Israeli ambassador's residence in London, and Gilad Shalit was there, and after doing quite a lot of programmes about his plight, it was wonderful to see him there. So congratulations to him, that's really important.
Thank you.
And Andrew, it's good to have you back on the European Report representing ECI, the European Coalition for Israel. Andrew, you've just been in Israel recently. You've just come back, I think, only a couple of days ago. So how was your visit, and what did you learn?
Well, it's always wonderful to be in Israel. Every time I'm there, and I've been there many times, it's exciting. And I think it's one of the most fascinating places in the world to visit. It was the first time I've been there with my own family, and that brought a new dimension. A number of things really strike you when you're in Israel, and they struck me again this time. One of them is just how vibrant the economy is, the society. It's bubbling with so many things, and you see development, a lot of development going on in Israel. It's a vibrant, strong economy. Secondly, you see such a diversity of views and opinions and people. The Jewish community is very diverse, and the Israeli community is very diverse. From a religious perspective, but also socially, you have the immigrants from Ethiopia, you have the immigrants from Russia, you have the immigrants now from India. So many different kinds of cultures which are trying to blend together to form one nation. So you can't put Israel in a box, if you like. And that's exciting, and I think it's an enormous challenge for Israel to come to grips with. And a third aspect which I find very important is, I believe, a growing sense of desire and expectancy of the Messiah. You know, there is really a growing sense in Israel, broadly. You can talk to people on the street about their Jewishness, what it means to be Jewish, to believe in God, to expect the coming of Messiah, and you'll get a variety of answers. But you can talk about it, and it's becoming more, I think, conscious within Israeli mentality, and that probably has something to do with the growing threats that Israel face around them. But I believe, you know, we are witnessing the true redemption of Israel, and as the prophet Ezekiel talked about, you know, the dry bones receiving flesh and gradually gaining spirit as well. We're seeing God's prophetic word come into fulfillment. And you can really only see that and feel it when you're in Israel itself.
No, that's very true. Extremely true. And Charlotte, you're doing very important work on behalf of the Jewish community here in Belgium in terms of PR and Israel's image and what have you. Can you share with our viewers the important work you're doing on behalf of the Jewish community here in Belgium, but also on behalf of Israel as well?
Thank you, Simon. I'm very happy to be back in your program. Well, I have a few hats on my head. One is obviously Vice President of the Jewish community here in Belgium. Another one is President of ORT, which is an NGO in education, vocational training, one of the biggest NGOs in this field around the world. And the third one is my European PR agency, through which I have promoted Israeli high-tech companies in Europe in the 90s and even in the 2000s. And I must say that I'm very proud to be connected to what is known today as the Startup Nation, because I feel I contributed a little bit to this. And so how do I contribute on the PR level? Well, in the Jewish community, obviously, we are fighting anti-Semitism, we are fighting for the memory of the Shoah, and we have also today to fight the second Shoah, which is the Shoah of the memory of our history. And I came back from Vilnius with a group of friends of ORT. We visited the ORT school over there 2 weeks ago. And it's obvious that there are more than 200 Jewish cemeteries in Lithuania, which are to be restored. And the man in charge of this project tried to forward a message to the EU, in fact, because he thought that this might be a project taken by the EU to restore these cemeteries, which are in a very bad shape, and killing, in a way, a second time, the Jewish history in Lithuania, because it seems it started with the Shoah, but there is a very important Jewish life since the Middle Age until the Shoah started.
Excellent. And the first topic of discussion today is the issue of should Israel become a member of the European Union, and the new Italian foreign minister is a strong advocate that Israel should join, and she restated it recently on when Shimon Peres, the Israeli president, visited Italy on a state visit. It's very interesting, isn't it, that the fact that the new Italian foreign minister, if I can pronounce her name, Emma Bonino, is a strong advocate that Israel should become a member of the European Union. She was an EU commissioner herself and was an MEP, such as you are. What are your views on Israeli membership of the European Union, and should Israel be allowed to join?
I doubt that the membership status would actually serve Israel's own interest. And then we have the discussion that which countries actually belong geographically to Europe. We have had this same discussion with Turkey, for example. And I remember a few decades ago, Morocco was one of the countries who wanted to join EU, and then there was this kind of line that, okay, there is a Mediterranean Sea between the Europe and Morocco, and so Morocco is definitely not a member of Europe in that sense, and so they are not going to be member of the EU, but of course they are going to be cooperation. So I think that it's the same with Israel as well, that we need a lot of cooperation and better cooperation than what we are having now. For example, in the fields like trade, science, agriculture, education, culture, there is so much more that we could do and promote the relations between the EU and Israel. But membership, well, I have my doubts about that. I don't really think that it would even serve the Israel's own interests.
Yes. And Andrew, I very much want to bring you on board on this one. Ever since Israel was established or re-established back into the Middle East after 2,000 years of exile, because of Israel's Arab neighbours, Israel has been forced to trade with Europe and hasn't been recognised in the Middle East as a nation and a sovereign entity. And that's why Israel competes at international football tournaments in Europe, also the Eurovision Song Contest. And many argue that within the EU that Israel should not join, primarily because Israel is not actually in Europe, but Israel sees itself in Europe. You know, what's your view on this one?
Well, I mean, I think I'd agree with Sari. I mean, Israel is really in a, it's not really European in the sense that I think it's a mistake to see Israel as being born out of Europe. It wasn't born out of the Holocaust. Israel was born much earlier. Legally speaking, out of the First World War, not out of the Second World War. And it was out of the breakup of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. It belongs in the Middle East. It's part of the Middle East. It has a very strong European aspect. Of course, many of the Jews living there were refugees from Europe, escaping from the pogroms in Russia, Ukraine, White Russia, and later from Nazi Germany. I'm not sure they'd want to be part of Europe, and I'd agree with Sari. I don't think it would really be in their interests either to be part of Europe. The problem, as I see it, is with Europe is Europe's own problem. Europe has what I would call an identity crisis. In a way, Europe is based on two foundations. One is let's say, the Roman Greek humanist foundation, and the other would be the Judeo-Christian. And what we're seeing today is that the humanist Roman Greek thinking is taking supremacy. And everything that belongs to Christian values or Judeo values are being very much undermined. And I think a vibrant Jewish Israel would never feel comfortable in Europe. This is, in a way, the conflict that we're seeing. I don't think Europe understands Israel because we don't understand the mentality of Israel.
And Charlotte, I want to bring you in because Israel's President Shimon Peres has been a very, very strong advocate that Israel should join the European Union if the EU member states and the EU Commission decide one day to allow Israel to become a full member of the European Union. What do you think Israel can offer the EU?
Well, Israel offered already a lot to Europe in the past, not centuries, but since the beginning of the 20th century. And I think Israel has an asset, is that they are European-minded, democracy-minded, but they know very well the Middle East mentality because they had to cope with it for 100 years already. So I think this is a first big asset. The second asset is that I was involved 25 years ago already with the framework program, R&D framework program here established by the EU, involving Israeli companies, because it was a program enabling European companies to work, to partner with companies from partnering countries like Israel. And so I've been involved in this, and one of my clients, for instance, Orchid Communications, who has developed ADSL technology, was picked up by Italtel, the previous name of Telecom Italia. And Telecom Italia, thanks to the results of our PR campaign, of course, invited Orchid to join them in this R&D framework program. And I think this is an asset and a big, big cooperation that is already in place for so many years, and it's a fact. And I think that this can be continued. And as Shimon Peres says, he has signed a cooperation agreement. It was beyond his expectation. They became partners and they became friends. And I think the cooperation is going well. And also another asset of Israel is that it is at the border of democracy and I would say totalitarian states. And Israel has to cope with this as well. And they are, in a way, defending our democracy in Europe.
That's a very interesting point you make there, Charlotte. And sorry, I know that you're very much involved in economic committees, financial committees. Isn't there something that we can learn about Israel in terms of her economic output, the way she deals with a banking crisis, that all banks have liquidity, and Israel is a high-tech, modern, advanced, industrialized nation that's really using high-tech, which is fueling her economy. And now Israel has opened up natural gas fields off the shores of Israel. Surely there should be areas for greater cooperation and great things that Europe can actually learn from Israel.
Yes, Israel's economy is growing better than here in most of the European countries. And also what we could learn is that the new established SMEs are doing very well, especially in the field of new technology, ICT technology. They are growing fast. And so Europe could somehow learn how to promote these new entrepreneurs, how to encourage young students to get involved in business. In Europe, many young students, they rather would like to have a very secure career in civil servants and maybe in the public sector, but to encourage people to be entrepreneurs and to make their own fortune. I think that Israel has managed to do better in that field.
Yeah, and Charlotte, we know that if you are an Israeli, you reach a certain age as a teenager, I think 17, you have to join the Israeli army for 3 years, and for women I think it's a year and a half. But during that time, we see such incredible development of Israel's young people because they're given such responsibility at such a young age, which is creating that entrepreneur spirit in Israel. Surely this is something that Europe could actually learn from, particularly as so many youth across Europe feel marginalised. There's not much hope in terms of jobs and opportunities. So maybe we can actually learn something from Israel's experience on this one.
Absolutely. I've been involved personally with the Ministry of Industry and Trade for many years, and particularly with a department in this ministry that is very relevant today to US and Europe, because it's called the Chief Scientist Office. And the Chief Scientist Office is a team of people analyzing about 2,000 business plans a year that are being presented by youngsters, mainly young future entrepreneurs. And they're analyzing these business plans and selecting some of them, supporting them with subsidies. And at the end of the day, if the project succeeds, obviously the ministry will get royalties from the company. But if it fails, the young entrepreneur, potential entrepreneur, would not have any commitment. You see, that he wouldn't have to pay anything. It's a failure, but you can start again. You know, it's like the American spirit.
Excellent system, excellent system.
Voila. So you can try again and succeed the next time. So, but just try, give it a try. And today, you know, I was very amazed in Israel, you know, the companies I was working for in the 90s even were dedicating up to 5% of their turnover to R&D. It was amazing. And when you see here in Europe how little the percentage, it goes sometimes under 1%, dedicated to R&D, well then you are not preparing your future. And I think Israel has 40 years advance in this field, and obviously is now being copied, I would say, in a way, by countries in Europe. They're starting with projects to coach youngsters and to help them to become entrepreneur and start their companies. And yes, we have to witness, and I witnessed it personally in Israel. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing, and you have youngsters. I remember it started with a young boy, 14 years old, who had invented something in the internet, like, I'm talking about 15 to 20 years ago. And those young guys have become millionaires, billionaires before they were 20. And so this is the story of Israel, a startup nation, and I think Shimon Peres is very much involved in this, because he's promoting nanotechnology for centuries, not for centuries, tens of years, and he's very, very pushy in this field. And so yes, I think we have to recognize that Israel is an example in the world for entrepreneurship, and we should take it. We should take a lesson from it.
Absolutely.
Surely. In Europe's 2020 strategy, we have the goal to have 3% for R&D funding, and Israel is already having 5%. And the best European countries like Sweden and Finland, we are having around 5% of our GDP for R&D funding. So this is one of those explanations, yes, which is telling us that how to do this thing.
No, it's incredible. Absolutely amazing. The other issue we're going to be discussing today is the ongoing crisis in Syria. Now it's been documented by Israeli, British and American intelligence that Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, has actually used chemical weapons against his own people, particularly against the opposition forces in Aleppo. So we'll be asking now, should the EU take a greater role in intervening in this conflict? Charlotte, the current civil war in Syria has cost over the lives of over 70,000 people, Syrians, according to the UN. It's created a refugee crisis of over 1.5 million people. And now Bashar al-Assad's regime is using chemical and biological weapons against his own people. Is it time that the West, and particularly the EU, started to intervene in this conflict purely on a humanitarian grounds?
I think the answer is obvious. We should help, and it's a terrible story. I would like to mention that what amazes me the most is that this president of Syria, he was welcomed here in Europe by several chief of state, and like a chief of state himself. And it cannot be that those people here didn't know what was behind the face of al-Assad. I think we have to, I am puzzled. I'm personally puzzled as a citizen of Europe to see that the people who were welcomed here like guests, VIP guests, are now showing their real face. And my question to Europe would be, didn't Europe know who Bashar al-Assad was, in fact, really? And it's true, it's a terrible humanitarian problem. And I don't even know if you are aware that Israel has established a field hospital at the border of Syria a few weeks ago, and they are curing people who are coming to be getting surgery and to be saved. And it's a very discreet project, actually, and it was published by a press agency in the north of Israel, who had the scoop of this news because they're living there and they discovered it. And, but it was no real publicity about it. So I would like here to mention that the biased image of Israel in Israel is a big issue that I'm trying to tackle at my level for almost 20 years. And it's very, very sad, and you feel helpless almost, how to reverse this tremendous caricatured, biased information, while there is so much good things to say about the people of Israel and the country in the humanitarian field, for instance, but there are so many other fields.
And sorry, I just want to bring you on this one. I just got a quote from our British Prime Minister David Cameron, who said about the Syrian regime using chemical and biological weapons, and what he said. He says, "I choose my words very carefully, but what I see does look very much like a war crime is being committed in our world at this time by the Syrian government. Apart from liberal intervention, what other policies can the EU pursue to bring an end to this awful bloody conflict in Syria?"
Well, the EU's toolkit is very limited. The only weapon EU actually is having is the diplomacy and, of course, the political pressure and diplomacy in international arenas like UN. But EU doesn't have real military power, and I don't know if it even would be willing to use it, because the whole picture is getting more complex. It's no longer only a civil war. There are now different kind of militant groups, maybe even terrorist organizations. Also, the neighboring countries are getting involved in this. So we as an international community, we really should now think very carefully what we are actually going to do. What we know for sure is that there is a humanitarian catastrophe, and EU could have aid for those people who are suffering, who are refugees in the neighboring countries. But no longer you can see that where are actually the bad guys, where are the good guys. The picture is getting very, very mixed. And so I'm really worried that if the international community can find a way to have a ceasefire, because the ceasefire would be the first step. After the ceasefire, maybe a massive UN peacekeeping operation could be possible, but then all these parties which are now involved, they should accept the ceasefire and be really committed to that. And so this really needs a lot of efforts, and I don't know that who is having the key for this peace, because it really seems to be more and more complex than we never thought beforehand.
Absolutely, but I mean, as a MEP, how do you respond to this crisis? Because what we've seen really is a lack of international leadership on this Syrian crisis, and also condemning, for example, the use of chemical and biological weapons, which are forbidden in international conflicts and war, and it just really emphasises it, doesn't it, the seriousness of this situation, that he can actually use chemical and biological weapons against his own people.
Yeah, well, we can condemn these things, but to really have the peace, yes, to have the ceasefire, it needs the UN resolution. And we know that in UN, because the international community is not having the unanimous view of this issue, so it's stuck situation. So really what we can do as a EU is to help those people who are suffering, to help refugees, and to help the neighboring countries to take care. And I'm really very, very happy to hear that what Israel is now doing in the middle of this crisis. And I hope that the other countries would be also very willing to help these people. But what we need now is immediate ceasefire, and after that we can start to think that what would be the best possible solution for the country.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Andrew, we're talking about the issue in Syria, particularly now as it's become more serious, now that intelligence reports have been proved to be accurate in terms of Israeli intelligence, which has been confirmed by British and also American intelligence, that President al-Assad, the Syrian president, has used chemical and biological weapons on his own people, particularly sarin gas. And President Obama said last August that he drew red lines, that if the regime used chemical biological weapons against their own people, then America would intervene, and that would be a red line. Clearly those red lines are becoming blurred. What's your view on this issue?
Well, I'm not an expert on chemical weapons, but I've read what's going on. But I've also read that it's not only the regime which is using chemical weapons, but it's the rebels as well. I mean, there is a complex situation going here where it's not easy just to step in and say it's one side against the other. What we have seen is Israel intervening in the last few days to take action, to bomb in Damascus and near Damascus, to take out some of these installations. What they're concerned about primarily is the movement of weapons, including chemical weapons, from Syria into Hezbollah, Lebanon, They're concerned about the role of Iran, which is playing a very, very strong role in relation to Syria. As far as I'm aware, Israel is not pushing to have Assad put aside. They're deeply concerned about the alternative, which they know from experience. We've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it in Libya and other places where the revolution hasn't resulted in a better regime, or certainly not a more friendly regime to Israel. So I think Israel will be very concerned to see Assad actually lose this war because nobody knows what's going to happen, and there's a great possibility that we'll end up with a very, very extreme jihadic Islamic regime which will be very, very unfriendly towards Israel, which will be supporting Hezbollah, will be supported by Iran. In a way, you have a conflict within the Middle East in itself, don't we, between the Sunni and the Shiite countries. Iran is becoming more and more isolated. And perhaps for Israel, the greatest threat is the situation in Iran itself, with the nuclear bomb. So I would have thought there'd be more concern about America's role in relation to Iran than intervening militarily in Syria.
This is what the Israeli fears are, that if, for example, Obama has stated those are clear red lines, and they go over those red lines, where are the boundaries? So this is what Israel fears. For example, if, President Obama, which he said last August, that if the regime of Bashar al-Assad uses chemical or biological weapons against his own people, that's a clear red line. Yeah. And they fear that the same thing would happen with Iran, and that Iran would be able to develop nuclear weapons. So what they're really expecting is American military interventionism to ensure America's credibility on the world stage and also America's authority as the sole remaining world superpower.
I don't think it's Israel's... Israel doesn't need to protect America's credibility on the world stage. I mean, I think Israel's realising they've got to stand alone. And we've seen that in recent days, haven't we? They know they have to take action. And at the end of the day, they are alone. They cannot depend on America. They cannot depend on Europe, even on the UN. They have to be able to protect themselves. And I think the world needs to respect their right to stand up for themselves and protect their own security. So, I mean, I'm concerned when I see Ban Ki-moon and others, politely criticising Israel for taking action to protect their own citizens, because it shows a lack of understanding about the real fundamental powers and forces that are really taking a rise here in the Middle East. And this is not just about chemical weapons or Assad's regime. There's something very fundamental going on here. And it's threatening the existence of Israel, its existence. So it's not about America's credibility and I think America's lost its credibility anyway, to a large extent. And Israel is having to stand for itself. Excuse me.
Yeah. And Charlotte, I just want to very much bring you on this one. It's a very, very difficult scenario, not only for Israel but also for the region, because clearly what's going on is there's a power play between the Sunnis and between the Shia, which is being played out in this civil war in Syria, with the Iranians backing Bashar al-Assad with the deployment of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And Hezbollah have also now got involved, saying that they will defend Bashar al-Assad. Then we got the rise of al-Qaeda type groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafists, who are Sunni in orientation, being backed up by the Saudis, being backed up by the Egyptians and also by the Turks. So it's a very complicated mess. One of the greatest fears that Israel faces surely is that what could replace Assad could actually be far worse in terms of an Islamist regime that comes to power. Is Europe fully aware of the dangers and the security aspect to this conflict that could actually spill out from the Middle East into Europe?
I hope they are. I hope they are fully aware. And I think that the security threat is not only in the region, it's on democracies. and it's on our way of living, our freedom, our way of organizing the society. And it's completely different than what is happening in the Middle East surrounding Israel. And so, as I want to emphasize that Israel knows the mentality around the country. Israel is a democracy that has integrated Muslims. The Muslim society in Israel is representing 20% of the citizenship of Israel. So they know the mentalities and they're living together, and there is a multicultural, multi-religious, multicultural existence in Israel, which is a fact of life. And so it's very amazing what is happening around this country, just to point them out as the one who is responsible for whatever happens in the world and in the region. And Israel is just trying to stay, I think, quiet and observing what is happening around and trying to see where they can fit in protecting their security, their own existence, because it's a question of existence of the country, because the threats are just very clear. Ahmadinejad said it clearly, I think about almost 10 years ago, that Israel needs to be whipped out of the map of the world. I mean, it's quite amazing. It's looking like they want to prepare a second Shoah. And I think we have to be very, very careful, and I hope that the EU are aware, and I think there is an intelligence in this building, intelligence department, and that they would prepare very creative plans to combat this threat and not let it go, because the red line is just, as you said, blurred, and yes, we don't know where it is really today. And so I think it's also already crossed the red line. It's crossed for already a year at least in the Syrian situation. But the world stays quiet, and it's not really covered enough, I think, by the press, because it looks like people are afraid somehow to speak out against this totalitarian regime. And there is a kind of politically correct way of speaking, and not to be putting your own security into danger, because at the end of the day, this is the story.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, what we're seeing really in Syria is unprecedented in the fact that, unlike the conflict we saw in Egypt with the revolution there, or the civil war that emerged in Libya, which brought down Colonel Gaddafi, what we're seeing now in Syria is the implication that this conflict could actually spill out into neighbouring countries, and that's why the Turks have deployed Patriot missiles in Turkey and also in Jordan, because they're very scared, primarily because Syria has the largest stockpile of chemical or biological weapons. Now, isn't there a danger that what we're seeing in the international community is a lack of leadership? And, for example, if Assad is able to get away with using chemical or biological weapons, what does that say to other rogue states that may want to use chemical or biological weapons against their opponents or against their own people? There's nothing to stop them without any fear of reprisal or attack. And surely it's important that we see from the international community firmer action being taken place to actually prevent these use of these deadly and awful weapons.
In an ideal world, I would agree with you, but the problem is the international community is so diverse. It's difficult to get unanimity on these issues. The Arab bloc in itself is playing such a huge role in the UN. Not to forget the role of Russia in the Security Council, and China. So, yes, of course, we'd all love to see some kind of intervention to put a stop to this, but the reality is that we won't see it. There is a lack of leadership, so it comes down at the end of the day to individual countries taking action that best represents their own interests. And again, this is where I would, repeat, Israel has to take the action that it sees necessary to protect itself and its citizens in the context. I mean, it's living as a tiny little nation in the midst of these huge Arab nations going through a huge turmoil. And I would have thought that the larger nations, individually but also collectively in the UN, ought to be standing behind Israel in its defence of democracy, in its defence of human rights, in its defence of security. And as Charlotte says, they're doing all they can at a humanitarian level. We don't hear those stories. You don't hear about it in Gaza as well. You hear the bad stories, but you don't hear of all the work that's being done by individual Jews and Israelis, Arab and Jewish Israelis, to help people across the border.
And sorry, I very much want to bring you on into this aspect in terms of European security, because according to research here, that the Centre for the Study of Radicalisation has found out that there are over 5,500 foreign fighters that have joined the rebel forces against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and it's believed that there are over 600 come from the European Union. Now they become battle-hardened, experience in warfare. Isn't there a great threat to Europe now from these young, impressionable European Muslims who've gone to join the jihad in Syria, and once the fighting's over, come back and pose a real security threat to European security?
The EU's anti-terror unit is aware of this kind of scenario, and at the moment, according to the knowledge I have, they try to find out that by who these young people are recruited, and which are those ways that they are using for recruiting these people. And before we know exactly, I wouldn't hesitate to make any conclusions, but of course we should be very aware of this kind of threat. And also that because at the moment those people who are leaving to be fighters there, they probably are not very radical, or most of them are probably not at all radical. Maybe there are this kind of war tourism and some kind of experience of these kind of situations, or willingness to see world, and all these kind of very strange motives what young people could see or could have. But I think that what is important to understand, that when they are involved in this kind of situation, they might be radicalized over this period of time, and then when they are coming back, then there is a threat. We don't know that what kind of ideas are put in their head, and so that's where we should be very, very conscious and very worried about that, what these people are taught when they are there.
And final issue we'll be discussing today is the plight of women in the Middle East and what the EU can do to preserve women's rights and freedoms. Sorry, I'll come back to you on this one, really. So women across Europe historically have fought for equal rights. They fought for women to have the rights, and it really just shows you how the advancement of women's rights, as here you are an MEP representing your own nation of Finland here in the European Parliament. And now, as we've seen the emergence of the Arab Spring really much turning into the Arab Winter, there has been a real curb on women's freedoms with the rise of Islamism. What can the EU do to protect the plight of women?
With different programs, for example, inside the neighborhood policy, we should promote the role of women, especially now in the new regimes. Because I remember very well 2011 December, when we had the Mediterranean Union's Women's Rights Committee meeting here in Brussels. There were NGO representatives, female politicians from Egypt, from Tunisia, and they said that the situation is getting worse than it was during the dictatorships. And so they were very worried that what's going to be the future of women's rights, what is going to be the future of female possibilities in these countries. And so EU should, with its money and with its programs, to promote the females' positions, especially now when the new regimes are there. Because, for example, in Libya, when the new government was established, the first thing they wanted to establish was, or re-establish, was the polygamy, and the second was to have the Sharia law as a base of the constitution. So this is, as a Scandinavian woman, this is scaring me, what's happening there for our sisters in the North Africa. So we really, as a European, should be very concerned about the situation and should do whatever we can to help them.
Yeah. And Charlotte, I want to bring you on this one. Can you compare and contrast for our viewers the plight of women and the freedom that women enjoy in Israel in comparison to that within the Arab world?
Well, I didn't visit the Arab world, but I've met a lot of women from the Arab world. And this morning on BBC World, they were talking about this woman in Saudi Arabia who was disfigured by her husband. And we're talking about violence in couples, and it is a big issue. It is a very big issue, and the conclusion and the solution that was presented by the foundation who was represented there was not only helping and assisting the women who were suffering from this mistreatment, but educating the men that they have to respect a woman, that they have no right, that, you know, because the women think in this part of the world that they belong to God and they belong to their husbands. And they were suggesting that it's a question of assisting the women, helping them to become independent, studying and so on, educating the men to change in the mind the way they think about their wives and daughters, and also changing the law at the same time. And this would help maybe changing behaviors that people think in the Middle East countries, except Israel, that they have a right to do whatever they want, they feel, and this also includes the rape in couples, because it also exists within a couple. And so it was, it's an issue. It's an issue. I feel very sorry for these women, because I keep saying to everybody who wants to listen to this comment, is that our generation that lived after the Second World War, we are so privileged as women. We were living in freedom. We could study. We have rights. We almost are paid the same salary as men. I'm not sure, almost. And I think it's a wonderful period for women in Europe. And I feel very privileged and very sorry for the women who suffer in a middle-aged society today.
Yeah. And Angie, I want to bring you on this one, because a lot of Middle Eastern commentators and analysts are very, very concerned about the rise of the Arab revolutions that we saw in 2010 and 2011, now that the Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood and those affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood have actually taken power. And so what we're seeing really is with the demonstrations in Cairo and other places in the Middle East against the oppressive nature of these new regimes taking place, that we find that women are brutally raped and attacked for demonstrating against President Morsi in Egypt, and yet there's silence from the European Union. Isn't it important that Europe has that moral clarity to actually protect these women and protect women's rights in the region?
We have a saying in English, you're closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. And I think part of the problem we have is, I'm a bit skeptical about this whole issue, because at least from a European perspective, in 1973, Europe started a process, was called the Europe-Arab Dialogue. And it was a process to open up Europe to the Arab world. It was a positive policy that came out of the oil crisis and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, under the threat of terrorism and the threat of Arab boycotts, to open Europe to Arab influence. And you can look at the records and you can see the amount of money that was poured into this political process to create Arab education in Europe, to open up immigration for Arabs into Europe, and all of these kinds of things. At the same time, to put more and more pressure on Israel. Now, I'm not against, I'm not arguing here against the Arabs. What I'm arguing against is the mentality and the values that Europe is then starting to expose itself to. So it's very difficult for Europe to turn around now 40 years later and say to the Arab world that we have all these values which you should be respecting, because we've already told them that we value your values more importantly than our own. And one of those is the disrespect for women and minority groups. And at its deepest, it's disrespect for life and the freedom of the individual to be who they are. Yeah. The second reason I'm sceptical, I think, is that, you know, all of these things will never be solved by laws or regulations or even by education. We can never educate these men if their hearts are not changed. You know, if people's hearts are not changed, their minds won't be changed, and their actions won't be changed. So what we need is a revolution of the hearts and the minds of the people.
Exactly. Sadly, we're down to the last 5 minutes of the programme. So, sorry, I just want to quote something very significant, and this is from the Middle Eastern historian Bernard Lewis, who said that in the 1800s there was a debate in Turkey, and the Muslim world wondered why they were losing battles against the Europeans and while they're lagging behind in terms of technology. And so in his book he writes What Went Wrong. He quotes the Turkish writer called Namik Kemal, who writes, he said that the reason that we have fallen behind the West is in the way that we treat our own women. He said, by the way we treat our women, the way we do, we produce several negative results. The first and foremost, we deprive ourselves of the talents and services of half the population. We submit the early education of the entire population to downtrodden mothers. Is this one of the reasons why Israel is so successful in the Middle East? Because they utilize and empower women in their country?
Surely, Israel is a role model when we compare with its neighborhood. And when it comes to gender equality, of course, as a Scandinavian woman, I still want to encourage Israel to do even more and to strive even further. But I think that it's really the base, the gender equality, that it should be mainstream in every society and in all fields, in education, in healthcare, in social services, in working life, so that gender equality would be a principle in a society, not just something peculiar, and also that the men should be involved in promoting gender equality. Here in the West, we maybe made a mistake that the women's rights is some kind of phenomena of feminist movement, but in a societies we need both sexes. We need men and women to take care of the gender equality, and this should be the principle in all societies. So I think that through mainstreaming the gender equality, it should be put in practice.
Absolutely.
Yes, I would like just to remind a comment by Shimon Peres when he visited Belgium a few weeks ago. It was reminded the question, I think, by President Obama to him: how would you solve and make democracy of the Middle East? What is the problem? And he said the problem are the husbands, because they don't let their wives and daughters study. And as long as this situation will prevail, there won't be democracy in the countries who need it dramatically in the Middle East.
Absolutely, and I think we're down to last minute or so left of the programme, so anyone can sum up. So I'll leave it with you, Charlotte. What can we do, what can the EU do to help protect women's rights, or what would you like to see the EU do in particular in the Middle East?
I think there are some projects already in place. I heard of projects, people in charge of defending the rights of women in the Arab countries. I know of this project, it's in place. Now, I don't know about the results of all the activities. This would be interesting to look into it. What has evolved since they started this project? up to now. And then we can learn from it and we can prepare maybe a strategy for the future, because there is still a very, very big work to be done.
Absolutely, and that's why we're all here. So I want to thank you all for joining me on today's European Report, and sorry, thank you for the excellent work you're doing here in the European Parliament upon Israel, and I'm sure a lot of your Finnish viewers from TV7 will be very proud of the excellent work that you're doing on behalf of Finland. And Andrew, thank you again for representing the European Coalition for Israel and the work you do for Israel here in the European Parliament and other places. And Charlotte, who's a very special advocate for Israel here in Belgium and in the EU. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you, Simon.
And I want to thank you for watching today's European Report. As we've seen, we discussed in this programme today that should Israel join the EU? Well, I think that we leave that up to Shimon Peres and the political leaders between Israel and the EU. Maybe it'll happen one day. And certainly in terms of the crisis in Syria, it's important that we see intervention in this conflict, particularly by protecting the innocents who are caught up in this conflict. And it's important that we protect human lives and we do all that we can to end this brutal conflict in Syria. And on our final issue, it's only going to be with the advancements of the freedom of women in the Middle East that we're going to see a change in those societies, which could then lead to a full functioning democracy. So I want to thank you all for watching today's European Report here from the heart of Europe in the European Parliament.